Welcome to University Television Presents. I'm your host, Zeke Hopkins, and joining me today are former Representatives Kathleen Dahlkemper and Erik Paulsen. Kathleen served as the U.S. Representative for Pennsylvania's 3rd Congressional District from 2009 to 2011. Dahlkemper became the first woman to represent the northwestern region of Pennsylvania in Congress. Erik represented Minnesota's 3rd Congressional District from 2009 to 2019. He was a leading member of the Chief Tax Writing House Ways and Means Committee. Before his service in Congress, he was a member of the Minnesota State Legislature, serving as the House Majority Leader. Thank you both for joining us here today.
Thank you, Zeke. Great to be with you.
Yes, it's great to see you guys.
Look forward to it.
We're here for an event, Congress to Campus, and I can only imagine that this journey that you both took must have been quite a wild one to get to Congress. Is there anything that you guys can tell us about that? Or more specifically, what did your family think about this?
Go ahead.
Well, I'm a little more on the unusual side in that I had not been in any other political office before I ran for the United States Congress. My husband and I own a business, so was working with him in that business. I was a dietitian for many years. Always kept up on national issues, but it was actually at a dinner party when someone said to me, "You should run for Congress," and I laughed at him and told him he was crazy. And lo and behold, a few months later, I decided to throw my hat in the ring, and off I went. So I took on a 7-term incumbent in what was the 7-county region in the northwest portion of Pennsylvania. But I first had to get through a primary, 4 of us in the primary, and I won quite soundly in the primary and then went on to win. So for my family, this was something that kind of came out of the blue, honestly.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to my family throughout those months saying, "Do you think I should run? Do you think I should run?" And talking to friends and acquaintances I knew, and then talking to some people who actually knew what it would be like to run for Congress. And I never had anyone tell me not to do it. And so I did, and it was obviously a successful win.
Yeah.
But what an amazing experience for me and for my family, going through this whole journey into one of the highest levels of serving in this country in terms of being an office holder.
Yeah, thank you. And Erik?
Well, and it's certainly a privilege, of course, to be elected to any office. And my background in getting to Congress was a little bit different. I was a math major. Was in the state legislature, but never thought I would be in Congress. And it is a family affair. You talk about your journey. So I have 4 daughters, and I think their experience knowing their dad was probably knowing nothing but politics or helping their dad run for office, because it is a family affair from that perspective. Going to parades, going door knocking, attending events, making sure the TV's off at night so they're not watching nasty political ads. Because then their wife, their mom, or they would never vote for their dad if they believed what they saw on television, right? So, but I think probably the most challenging part of it also was recognizing that to go to Washington meant you were away from your family, and so that was a tough decision. Should the family move to D.C.? Should they stay in Minnesota? We made the decision, obviously, they should stay with their school, their friends, and stay in Minnesota. But that's a challenge and a stressful time for the family as well.
Yeah.
But a great opportunity and a great privilege to serve.
Yeah, well, thank you both for that. On that note, what is the best part about being in Congress?
I think the best part about being in Congress is helping people.
Yeah.
It's meeting with constituents, making a difference, taking a concern of theirs, whether they voted for you or whether they didn't, and then trying to have a positive impact and better people's lives. And so as a Republican with my Democrat colleague, we came in the same class together, actually, in 2008. Yeah. And so I think if you want to be successful as a legislator, you need to build cooperation and consensus and be willing to compromise on things. And sometimes that can be a dirty word, unfortunately, in today's political environment, but it's very important if you want to be successful.
Yeah.
Everyone I have met along the way who's been in any elected office and has really, I think, gone with the intent to try to make their community better, make their state, their country better, to do something to positively impact people's lives. And I think too often people in political office get vilified these days. Yet what I saw was people really had the right intentions going in and as they served and really wanted to try to make a difference. And that's what I loved to do, was to make a difference. There's a couple things that happened in my 2 short terms in Congress that I can look back on. One is the Young Invincibles, which is part of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, allowing young people to stay on their parents' insurance till 26. That was my bill. that Erik actually co-signed on, and
Yeah.
there was a lot of bipartisan support for it that went through. It's allowed peace of mind for the parents of the young people and giving those young people peace of mind that they have health care coverage until they hopefully have a job that provides that. So when you think about something like that, you can do something that impactful that impacts millions of people, and when you're in Congress, that anything you're voting for will impact millions of people. You can look back at that and know that your time obviously was well spent serving the American people.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I love to hear you guys both say just serving your people. On a contrary note, what is one of the hardest or most difficult things about serving in Congress to you?
Well, I will say, and I think this is probably a universal thought amongst most of us, it's having to run every 2 years and
Yeah.
having to raise the amount of money that you have to raise and to do all of the activities that you have to do to run every 2 years. So you really have two full-time jobs. One is serving as a member of Congress and doing the legislative work, and the second is being a fundraiser for your campaign going forward. And it's grueling. Your time is taken up trying to meet your constituents, trying to meet their needs, and then trying to meet your constituents to get their votes. So it's a dual track that you're on, and you're never off of it because of the 2-year time frame for re-election.
I would absolutely agree. Running every 2 years can be very grueling, rewarding in many respects, but it's constant. It seems like it just never ends. And when you have to run every 2 years, you don't get a breather between election cycles, with campaigns starting so early, unfortunately. But I think the other hard part was recognizing as you meet with constituents regularly, sometimes they only meet with you if they want to ask for something, right? Or they'd like to have something. Sometimes you have to say no. It's good to listen. It's good to get their perspective and engage with them. But you can't do everything for everybody, right? Because you have to make decisions ultimately about what you could support or afford to support, right? In the context of spending, et cetera. So sometimes you have to make decisions based on the information you collect. And so it's important to meet with constituents, hear them out always, but you can't always agree with everybody all the time. Yeah,
very true. Well, as someone who is in media and a media professional, I wonder what you both think about media coverage in politics and this new age of what it's become in the media. Social media nowadays is a big thing, and that's obviously had its impact. Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
It's much more complicated than it used to be because there's so many different avenues, right, to get your message out or for another message about you to be put out. And I think that's going to continue to be a challenge going forward. Media is really important. And my biggest fear is that so many areas of this country are losing their local media coverage.
Yeah.
The national media story is what it is. But as a representative representing a district, you want that district to hear your message, and you want to talk about the issues that are important to them, not maybe some of the other issues that are more of the flashpoints that are out there that doesn't really affect maybe the daily life of the people you're representing. So I think that's part of the biggest concern for me. In the long run, we're losing our local newspapers, we're losing our local television stations, radio stations, and everything's becoming the national narrative instead of really looking at the issues of your region.
Yeah, and maybe to follow up on that, I think one of the things that is missing in journalism, we'll say journalism in media, is that it's important to have sources of information and news, right? And I grew up collecting news just from different resources, right? Radio, television, et cetera. Today it's more about entertainment, right? A lot of the national components that share news information or social media shares news information, it's more about entertainment or just keeping that news or media within a certain bubble. And so I think it unfortunately, in a divided America, and there's a lot of division across the country, people tend to stick within their bubbles and not being as interested in listening to journalists or the media present an opposing opinion. It's always good to be challenged and listening to the opposing point of view.
Yeah, I do agree with you guys, especially with the local news thing, because you guys are there to represent your district and try to get things pushed forward, but of course on a federal level. So I wonder if you deal with any of those difficulties, and is there any way to get around that to sort of reach out to these people in your district besides national news coverage? Do you go to those local news stations, or is that something you're interested in as representatives?
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky in the area I live in and have represented. There still are local television stations. our local newspaper is now owned by big conglomerates, so the staff is down to, I think, about 12 to 15 people versus, I don't know how many, probably 100 that was there before. So it's a little bit more difficult to get that message out there. They're limited in what they can cover, because you want them to also cover what you're doing in Washington, so on a local level. And that's, I think, part of the problem is if everything is owned in just a big conglomerate, it's hard to get your message out there. And as somebody who's representing, you want the people to know what you're doing.
Yeah.
I think part of that is, recognizing we had a small town local paper in my community too, where I lived, and they would accept columns that I would write and talk about what we were working on in Congress, and which was great. But now that small paper now has essentially dissolved and is only online, and so I don't think there's as much visibility for the content, right, for folks that are in public office to share what they're working on, right? So it's more challenging.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've both been talking about in some of the other groups we've been talking with is the fact that some members of Congress have become celebrities and raising money all over the country that never happened before.
Yeah.
We had social media that's allowed that to happen. And it's often the people that are on the far right or the far left.
Mm-hmm.
You think of an AOC, you think of a Marjorie Taylor Greene, and obviously everyone knows their names across the country. They are both extreme in their parties. And so I don't know that really bodes well for trying to really come together as a country and finding solutions, because it's usually those who are a little more centrist who kind of come together and find the bipartisan legislation that can pass.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. What are some things that people tend to misunderstand about Congress? What are some of the big misconceptions, do you think?
Well, I think there's some misconceptions of sort of an appreciation for how much work that members of Congress do to serve the public, right? I mean, it's, a typical day will be wake up in the morning, go to a morning event, and then you'll have a series of meetings throughout the day that may be 10-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute, 5-minute, in between your committee hearings and your voting as well. And then you come back home late at night after an evening event, maybe sign letters to your constituents. So it's a long 14, 16-hour day, typically. And then when you get home to the district at the end of the week, then you've got to make sure you're visiting with your small businesses, going to your Rotary clubs. And so there's a misunderstanding, I think, of how much work is involved for folks that run for office. So it's not just when they see my campaign time, but it is a regular, every day, every week activity that takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's very true. One of the things that I get dismayed about is that people don't respect people in political office, particularly if they're on the other side of the aisle from where their beliefs are. Yeah. And yet everyone, doesn't matter where their political beliefs are, they work hard and work every day for the people they represent. So I guess to reiterate that, saying I think that's one of the things that I hope that people would take from, if they listen to this, is to thank the people that are running for office, because they stand up, put their name on a ballot, and once you put your name on your ballot, your privacy is gone. And I think that's the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is how much of your privacy really goes away. You are now an open book to be scrutinized in every move that you make.
Yeah.
And I should mention one other component I think is very important is just the importance of civility and appropriate discourse in politics, which is in a hyper-partisan environment. It was partisan, I think, when we were in office. Now it's hyper-partisan, and so that's challenging. If you're going to a town hall meeting or meeting with folks and people are shouting at you, yelling at you, I mean, you can disagree, but that civility in public discourse needs to be appropriate.
Yeah. Huh. Do you guys have, on a more personal experience note, do you have any regrets from your time in office?
I have none. I mean, I am nothing but grateful because it was an opportunity to serve. And I never looked at it as a career, even though I served for the Minnesota legislature before being in Congress. So I've always had the view from a citizen legislator perspective that you can do something and then serve and then go back and do regular life and let someone else do it.
Yeah.
I have no regrets either. It was a huge honor. I mean, it was an amazing experience to serve in the United States Congress, and met great people along the way. Met Erik, met many, many people. When you can sit there and say, well, I had intimate dinner with Madeleine Albright, 9 of us. I mean, that's just an incredible experience I never thought I would have in my life, and that and many, many others, right? So there's great opportunity, but it is truly an honor to have served.
What do you say to people who say their vote doesn't matter or that they don't care about politics? Because I think that's something we have seen trending, of course, all throughout our history, but I think more recently it's become a bigger thing.
So I'm from Pennsylvania, a very purple state.
Yeah.
And I'm from one of the most purple counties in Pennsylvania. And every vote, I can tell you, counts. When you look at the numbers in some of the most recent elections, whether you're talking about Pennsylvania, whether you're talking about Georgia, whether you're talking about many other states that have been very close elections, those votes count. And one of the things that I often speak of when I'm speaking to younger people is that their vote really does count, and if they care about these issues, encourage people of your generation to get out, because the reason why seniors get what they want is because they vote.
Yeah.
So Medicare, Social Security, all those issues that seniors care about, nobody ever wants to touch them because they know that all the seniors, not all, but the vast majority of seniors vote. When it comes to the younger generations, they haven't come out in as great of numbers. I hopefully see a good trend in that changing. Mm-hmm. But the issues that are important, I think the environment is a very important issue to the younger generations. And again, some of us won't be here when some of these problems could really manifest themselves in a devastating way. We need, young people to get out, and their vote will count.
Yeah. It is so important to vote. I mean, the world belongs to those who show up, and you shouldn't complain if you don't show up to vote. I mean, in Minnesota, for instance, we have had notable elections where Jesse Ventura won as governor of Minnesota. He was a former professional wrestler, right? And he shocked the world, as he would say, by winning and collecting a lot of independent votes from folks that were disenfranchised. And Minnesotans tend to show up to vote. And we're one of the highest turnout states in the country, typically. And in a race like mine, it was a district that always had ticket splitters, and folks would vote for the Democrat and the Republican, but they would vote for the person over the party, which is why I was able to be successful for 10 years.
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned that the young people are the ones who are least likely to vote. Are those typically seen as people to seek out new voters? And does that become a way for you to prioritize some things in legislation?
Certainly, I've always reached out to the younger voters and tried to get them to come out.
Yeah.
We have 4 universities in our area, and a lot of people come from other areas, but they can register to vote in our district, in our county, if they want to. So we've always tried to do a lot of voter registration drives in those at those schools. And it's interesting because Pennsylvania, particularly in the presidential years, is such a important state. They will register to vote if they don't already live in Pennsylvania too, so that their vote might count more than if they're in, a state that's New York State, for example. If they came from New York State, where they know it's going to go blue no matter what. So I think that continues to be important. And as a Democrat, the demographics for us are in favor of trying to get more people out in the younger generations to vote. They tend to lean more left. But again, I think it's been a perennial issue for a very long time.
I think I always sought out young audiences, obviously wanting their support and talking to their friends, et cetera, but just trying to make sure they were inspired to think about public service themselves or how they could make a difference for their future. And so that was a big motivator for me, and having young people. I think legislatures around the country at different state levels and in Congress, you always have sort of these elder statesmen who have been in leadership. And look at the U.S. Senate; they have folks in their 80s, and even 90s. You need fresh ideas. You need young blood, and that was always a motivator for me to meet with students and to hopefully inspire them to be involved in politics.
Yeah.
I'm a big proponent of trying to get more women to run, but I'm also a big proponent of trying to get younger people to run for office. As to Erik's point, when we have a diverse population sitting around a table, we're going to come up with better ideas than we are if we just have, all older people. I don't know if you remember this, Erik, but when we first went to Congress, I was invited to a reception that was happening for John Dingell, who was from Michigan. He was being celebrated as the longest-serving member of the House. So I went to this ceremony, and when I got there, I realized he had been in the House longer than I'd been alive, and I was 50 years old. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is incredible that these people stay this long.
Yeah.
And I love John Dingell. He was a great guy, and he was about 90. But I thought, how can he really understand what's going on? And honestly, if you've been in Congress for 50 years, you're so far removed from reality in terms of life, because there is something when you go to Congress, the door opens for you for lots of things. And so if you've been there for 50 years, can you really remember the struggles of what it was like to kind of live the normal life of not being in politics? So I do agree that we need young blood coming through, and it would be nice to see more and more young people, be at the table for these discussions.
I remember that well, because Congressman Dingell was also there, well before I was born as well. And students would ask me about, the pin. We get a little congressional pin. Well, on the back of your pin is a number that represents your seniority.
Okay.
So out of 435 members, we first get elected, I was like 431, or it was or 420. It was a really low number. But Congressman Dingell had the number 1 on the back of his pin. He'd been there for so long. So.
That is wild. What is something that you guys have thought during your terms, or now in politics, that you've thought the opposite party has had a good idea with? I know both of you seem more moderate, and you sit here next to an opposite party member and are jovial. But what is something from the opposite side that you've always thought was a good idea?
Well, I think one thing that I learned a lot from my Democrat colleagues was how important the Violence Against Women Act was. And I think I learned that from some of my efforts in human trafficking, for instance. Okay. And that had always been a championed issue by many of my Democratic colleagues who I think focused on, rightfully so, on that time and attention that issue needed over a long period of time. And renewing it on a regular basis at a federal level was so important. And so I think a lot of the conversations I had with folks really emphasized how important that was to me, and why it made a difference in so many people's lives.
Yeah.
I just think there's a number of things that I was always considered a blue dog Democrat, and so more moderate. And, I think as a small business owner, seeing some of the issues that were very onerous on small businesses, and maybe the Republicans champion more to reduce some of those things that were onerous, I've always kind of leaned towards supporting those policy changes when possible. But both parties have good ideas.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that we can't come together and really bring those good ideas and meld them more than we do. I was very supportive of the Affordable Care Act and getting that passed. And there was good ideas on the other side of the aisle. What I felt and observed was that the partisan divide started to happen, and it became more about election on both sides, and kind of kept us from really finding more of the common ground that I think we could have found in passing something that would be good for all.
Yeah. Well, you guys had both mentioned that you don't have any regrets from your time in office, but would you go back to Congress? And if you did, what sort of things would you prioritize?
So after my term in Congress, I ran for county executive and have served for the last 8 years just recently. I could have served for 4 more. Well, I could have run for election, hopefully been elected. And I decided not to. Just time of my life, my husband was retiring. Your family gives up a lot. And, to Erik's point about that. And so I'm glad to have the time with my family. And it's kind of interesting because of course, everyone's been on the news about Senator John Fetterman, who is a friend of mine, and he currently is in the hospital, and so there's been all this buzz out there. Is he going to stay? Is he going to resign? And does he need to be replaced? And my name popped up recently as a possible replacement, because in Pennsylvania the governor can appoint. Oh. And because I'm from Western Pennsylvania, and we've never had a woman senator, and all of this, and a couple of my friends sent it to me and said, I like the sound of Senator Dahlkemper. And I think if I was just, and I'm not old, I'm 65, but I'm older than you all, but I think if I was 10 years younger, something like that would really intrigue me.
Yeah.
But again, I actually think that we need a younger voice in there. I think we need some of the younger generation to really step up. John Fetterman is quite a bit younger than I am, so a good 10 years anyway. And so I think that's important. And I think sometimes personally you just know when it's time to step back. And for me, it was time for me to step back from politics.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some things that I miss. I miss interacting with some of my colleagues. I miss being on the Ways and Means Committee, which was a wonderful committee to actually engage in thoughtful policy. And the members of that committee tend to be more thoughtful in nature, not just speaking to the C-SPAN camera, but engaging in some real policy discussions on tax and trade and healthcare issues. So I would never close the door, but I have no plans to do that because I'm just very grateful for having had the privilege to make a difference. And hopefully others will step up and will be comfortable with supporting folks to carry on some good traditions and make a difference.
Yeah, well, thank you. And what do you think of our Congress now that we have? Is there anything that sticks out to you?
That's a loaded question.
I know.
Well, as Kathy mentioned, unfortunately, I think there are some members of Congress, when they run now, they don't necessarily run with the intent of legislating. I mean, it's more about celebrity and catering to a specific political base, as opposed to really being able to be willing to compromise or being consensus builders. Because ultimately, as a legislator, you're not an executive. You have to work with folks on all different sides, different geographies, different parties, to get your idea incorporated into legislation if you're going to be successful. And so there are a lot of celebrities that are motivated by star status or raising money, and that's tough to see, I think.
Yeah.
And again, I think that the hyperpartisanship that we're seeing now is really disheartening, because it is an amazing institution, our Congress is, and we need a Congress that's functioning well. We've got a lot of issues. We all know that, from national security issues to the environment to a host of other things in between. And with all these serious issues in front of us, we need a serious Congress who's willing to find those compromises and willing to find those solutions and bring the right knowledge to the table, right? Mm-hmm. And to then listen to that knowledge and to make good decisions. So that concerns me with this hyperpartisan nature that we're seeing.
Yeah. Well, again, back to your own personal experience from when you served, what is one of the first things that comes to mind when I ask you about your first year or first years in office?
One of the first things that comes to my mind, wow, it was a surreal experience when I first went down. But the fact that you can actually make a difference. I was only there 2 years, and yet I have very important amendment to the healthcare law that is saving people's lives every day. Another smaller, very targeted thing was I had a constituent who was a first responder after the 9/11 attacks. She was working for the Red Cross. She'd come into my office and talk to my staff, and my staff said, "You've got to meet this woman." She had all of the same respiratory illnesses that the firefighters and the police and people in New York City did. And what I came to learn from her was that in 48 states across the country, there were people like her. And these people were very ill, and many of them were dying, and yet they didn't have any healthcare coverage for their multiple diseases. So I got very involved in helping pass the Zadraga bill, which is a 9/11 compensation, first responder compensation bill. Since it was one of the last bills, it was passed, I want to say like 2 or 3 days before Christmas, before I left Congress. And I remember calling my friend Laura, now she's my friend, and the two of us crying on the phone. And so it was a very specific bill that didn't affect any more than 1 or 2 people in my district, but it made a difference in her life and the life of so many other people. Since then, that bill was reauthorized, I think during Trump's era, and then again has been reauthorized so that they're going to have coverage for 75 years. Okay. And by then, they'll all be deceased, probably. So that's something that I look back on, very personal to me, because I knew this woman, my constituent, who I didn't know beforehand, but became very close friends with her and was able to help get something done. And then this much bigger thing. So, again, you can go down there, whether you're down there for 2 years or for 50, and you can make significant changes and helping people's lives be better. Yeah.
Boy, lots of things that I would remember in my first term or just being in Congress. But one thing I do remember is the first initiative that I passed that became law and signed by President Obama was my initiative to make sure that survivors of law enforcement or first responders, their survivors' benefits for the spouse would not be taxed by the IRS, because that was becoming an issue, apparently, in many states. And so was able to pass that and get a signature, which was a highlight for me to see a legislative initiative pass. And then meeting with constituents and then championing their views, and then having the opportunity to travel to different areas with the Iraq War and Afghanistan. We were talking about that earlier in our travels to some of those war zones, if you will, was very eye-opening and educational, but necessary for public, I think, officials to serve if they're going to be making decisions based on what our military is facing, for instance. So those are some of the memories I have.
Yeah. You guys have both mentioned that there's something about having a priority with your district. What were some of the things from each of your districts that you prioritized when running and after actually getting into office? And is there any sort of difficulty trying to make these priorities from your district feel represented on a federal level?
It can be, one of the things that is hard to do is to find a vehicle to move your legislation forward. And so, especially if it's something that's not as maybe broad as to get the support of everyone that you want. I'm on the Great Lakes, so Great Lakes issues are huge. I was on the Great Lakes Caucus, which is a group of members of Congress who come together on an issue. And so we wanted to protect the Great Lakes. And so a lot of kind of very geographically specific issues that, maybe are harder to pass. But when you're talking about the Great Lakes, you've got a lot of states, so you've got a lot of members that can help coalesce around that. So, but I think, for me, one of the other things, and I think Erik probably had some similar issues to this, because the northern part of the country, particularly Northeast, often thought of as a Rust Belt, but industry that had been really devastated, and a lot of it by China. And so I was always trying to fight on these Chinese steel issues, and that was really important to my constituents. The steel mills were really being hurt by China dumping steel into our country, and the price of steel then going so far down that we couldn't be competitive. So that would be a very specific issue to those areas that create steel, and not always easy to find the legislative solution and get the support that you need for something like that.
Yeah.
You've heard the slogan, all politics is local. Well, one of the issues that I championed or spent a lot of time on was medical technology or medical device issues, because that was a core constituency in Minnesota. You think of Medtronic, right? Yeah. And which was formed in Minnesota, and then all the other companies that sort of spun off from Medtronic. So Minnesota's #1 per capita in the U.S. for our medical device jobs. So I co-chaired the Medical Technology Caucus. And again, a caucus is a number of members bipartisanly that may represent that interest, right? And so there were several dozen of us, and we would talk about what was important. So it might be repealing the medical device tax, which was in the Affordable Care Act, that became an issue for a lot of these companies. And so I ended up spending my time traveling around to different areas of the country, speaking with different life science organizations to understand what was important to them in other areas of the country as well, in California and Florida and the East Coast and Massachusetts, and then working with other colleagues and educating them on the importance of why this was a big deal for them as much as it was for me in my own home district.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. Is there anything else that you would like to add or that you'd like to discuss before our time is up here?
Well, one thing I would like to say to everyone listening is think about running for office.
Yeah.
Some point in your life, consider running for office. It could be your local school board, your local city council, state government, Congress. We need good people to stand up and run for office. And if you are not the person who runs, then volunteer for somebody's campaign. Find somebody who you really believe in, somebody that you really think is going in for the right reasons and that you support, and work for their campaign. You will learn so much about politics, how things work in this country, civics. You'll learn so much about yourself if you do that. So I encourage everyone to run for office, and if you don't want to do that, then at least volunteer once in your life for a campaign.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And I guess in closing, I just want to thank you for hosting us this morning. And it's wonderful to be on campus and know that there are students that are engaged in public policy as we continue to meet with students all day today and tomorrow. And so it's just a great opportunity to hopefully help inspire some future leaders that your state and our country need.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure having you both here and to hear about your careers and just your thoughts today. And thank you all at home for joining us. I'm your host, Zeke Hopkins, and we will see you next time on University Television Presents.